When we think about learning, most of the time we picture students studying in a classroom or studying online, taking notes, listening intently to a teacher or lecturer. But in psychology, learning means something else. Psychologists define learning as a long-term change or a permanent change in behavior due to experience. So, a general definition of learning is to say that learning occurs when you have some experience and it results in a change in your thought or in your behavior. Changes that result from maturity or growth, emotions, drugs, intoxicants, or alcohol are not considered as learning. The reason we have this definition is that we don't consider learning to be something that you just do one time, and it is based on experience. So let me give you an example. When I was a kid and my mom told me that the fire was hot and not to touch off the fire because it's hot, but I didn't believe my mom and touched the fire and I burnt myself. Now I learned not to touch the fire anymore because it's hot. So now I have a relatively permanent change in behavior, not because I'm an adult, but I changed because of the experience that I had. So if you have an experience and then your thoughts and your behavior changes, we can say that you've learned something. Some sort of learning has occurred. The psychology of learning focuses on a range of topics related to how people learn and interact with their environments. Most of the learning that we are going to be looking at in this chapter would fall under the heading of behaviorism. During the first half of the 20th century, the school of thought known as behaviorism rose to dominate psychology and sought to explain the learning process. Behaviorism was the school of thought in psychology that sought to measure only observable behaviors. By that, we look for observable changes in behavior as evidence that learning has occurred. The three majors of learning described by behavioral psychology are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, or instrumental conditioning, and observation learning. Let's talk about classical conditioning first. This is based on a famous experiment on dogs by the Nobel Prize-winning physiologist Ivan Pavlov. Classical conditioning is described as the learning of association between one stimulus and another stimulus. Pavlov won his Nobel Prize for studies on digestion in dogs. He didn't set out to study learning, but while he was studying digestion and collecting saliva from dogs, he noticed something strange happening in the dogs. He came to notice that, of course, the dog would produce saliva in response to the food. That was expected. But he observed that when a person carrying the food walked into the room, and when the dog saw the dishes, the dog would also start to produce saliva before he gave them the food. He thought, that's strange. It seems the dogs have learned. They know that the food is coming. In his experiment, Pavlov implanted little tubes connected to the salivary glands of these dogs so he could collect the saliva. When he started preparing food to feed the dogs, these little tubes start filling up with saliva. This preparation process has somehow given them a clue, and their bodies are actually responding. They started to salivate as if the food is already in front of them. Later on, he began investigating and tried to figure what kind of things we could do to teach the dog that the food is coming on its way. Pavlov showed dogs some food and rang a bell at the same time. After repeated pairings of this sort of bell and food, the dog would associate the bell with the food. They would learn that when they heard the bell, they would get fed. And eventually, just ringing the bell made the dog salivate. They learned to expect the food at the sound of the bell. So I'm going to introduce a number of terms to refer to these different items. Pavlov came up with a few words and we need to make sure we understand. Under the normal conditions, dogs salivate when they see and smell the food. food. We call the food unconditioned stimulus. If you give a dog food, a predictable thing will happen in all cases. No learning process is involved. When we give them food, they will salivate. So we call the salivation the unconditioned response. In other words, the dog doesn't need to be taught anything in order to salivate to the food. In this case, a bell is a neutral stimulus. The bell doesn't have any meaning to the dog. The reason why we say that a bell is a neutral stimulus is if you go up to a dog and you ring a bell, there is no predictable response that occurs. So it's neutral. When we pair an unconditioned stimulus like food with something that neutral like the sound of the bell, that neutral stimulus. In this case, a bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. With these three parts here, we can see how to do this classical conditioning process. The conditioning process is that we start with a neutral stimulus, which is a bell, and then we follow that with the unconditioned stimulus that we haven't had to teach the dog, which is the food in this case. And then that unconditioned stimulus will automatically be followed by an unconditioned response. So we have the bell, food, and salivating. Then we just repeat this over and over again. The conditioning process involves just repeating this. If you do this enough times, eventually the dog doesn't need food to salivate. The bell can cause the salivation. Now there are some new terms. So bell as the neutral stimulus is no longer neutral. Now it's actually causing a response, and it's a response that we taught the dog. Now the bell is conditioned stimulus, meaning a stimulus that has been taught to the dog. It required training in order to get this to occur. So the bell goes from being a neutral stimulus to now being a conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus, salivating to food, is now a conditioned response. It is one that has been taught. So we say it's conditioned response. In this case, we mean salivating to the bell is what has been taught. So let's see the video of Pavlov's experiment together.
Pavlov's aim was to discover what caused saliva to flow. He rerouted the salivary ducts to the outside of his dog's cheek so that he could collect and measure the spittle. Perhaps, he thought, the production of saliva might be the result of a fixed nervous reflex, like a knee jerk.
5 минут 42,5 секунды.
After taking many measurements of spittle, he confirmed that the dogs drooled automatically when their tongues touched food. He called the response the salivation reflex.
4,5. Хорошая собачка. Я предлагаю поменять собаку.
But his work started to run into trouble. As his dogs became familiar with the experimental routine, they started to fill their cheek tubes before Pavlov had a chance to stimulate their tongues. The dogs were learning to anticipate food. Pavlov tried a new technique. He erected screens so that the dogs couldn't see what was going on. Before passing meat through the hatch, he introduced a stimulus that was totally unrelated to feeding. A ticking metronome. At first, the dog dripped saliva into its cheek tube only when the food appeared. But after a number of trials, the dog began to connect the ticking with the arrival of meat. Soon, the sound alone made the dog drool.
And this is how classical conditioning was discovered. So this is essential process of classical conditioning. In Pavlov's experiment, the bell was the neutral stimulus. You pair a neutral stimulus or a bell with an unconditioned stimulus or the food over and over again. Each time you get an unconditioned response until eventually you have a situation where the conditioned stimulus evokes the conditioned response. And now we can see some form of learning has occurred. We have conditioned the dog to salivate to the bell. This is what we've taught. This is what has been
Whatever the
conditioned.
stimulus,
You pair
these
a
dogs
neutral
could soon be
stimulus with
conditioned
an
to
unconditioned
select.
stimulus enough times that it becomes a conditioned stimulus, which causes a conditioned response. We see how it works with animals,
believed
but
that
how
he had
does it work with
discovered
humans?
how animals
Here are
learn,
some examples of
even in the
classical
wild.
conditioning in our everyday life. A warm and nurturing teacher makes students feel connected. Students associate going to school to the teacher. Therefore, students learn to enjoy going to school. The second example, a harsh and strict teacher makes students feel bad. Students associate going to school to the harsh teacher and learn to feel bad about going to school. And the next example, playing games with parents makes a child happy. The child associates homework doing with playing games and learn to feel good while doing homework. The next example, getting a flu shot hurts and makes a child cry. The child associates the needle with getting a shot and cries at the sight of the needle. Another example, a parent praising a child's good behavior makes them feel proud. The child associates the behavior with the praises and engages in more good behavior. In the study of psychology, conditioning is the process of pairing two stimuli together so that one stimulus can trigger the reaction simply by learned association. You can easily find classical conditioning scenarios in everyday life. This learning by association is classical conditioning. We are going to look at another example related to classical conditioning. There is a famous study known as the Little Albert experiment. This study was conducted by John B. Watson and his graduate student assistant in 1920. They took a 9-month-old infant, Little Albert. They presented the baby with a number of stimuli including a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, and various masks. These stimuli were very neutral. Little Albert showed no fear of any of these stimuli. He didn't show a strong response to them. Watson and his assistant decided to pair the white rat as a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. In this case, the unconditioned stimulus was a loud bang from a steel bar that was hit by a hammer behind his head. The sudden loud noise made him cry. This loud noise caused an unconditioned response. After 7 pairings of the rat and noise, Albert reacted with crying and avoidance when the rat was presented without a loud noise. Let's see the video of the experiment together.
In the early part of the 20th century, psychologists John Watson and Rosalie Rayner set out to teach a baby boy called Little Albert to fear white rats using the principle of classical conditioning. This is a film of their work. The film shows several phases of their study. First, as you see here, the investigators demonstrated that prior to conditioning, Little Albert had no fears of any animals, including, of course, white rats. Watson and Rayner then sought to teach Albert to fear white rats through classical conditioning. In the conditioning phase of the study, which was not filmed, the investigators struck a steel bar with a hammer whenever Albert reached for a rat, making a very loud noise that greatly upset and frightened Albert. After 6 such pairings of the loud noise and the rat, it was believed that the boy had been conditioned to fear white rats. That is, Albert was now expected to react fearfully to white rats whether the rats were paired with loud noises or not. In this next film sequence, we see Albert interacting with a white rat after the conditioning process. The investigators believed that the child's reaction during this trial demonstrated his newly acquired fear of white rats. Finally, the investigators expected that Little Albert's conditioned fear of white rats would generalize to stimuli that were similar in key ways to a white rat. In this film segment, they were trying to demonstrate that the child now also reacted fearfully to similar objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a furry object, and a white mask worn by Watson himself.
After the continuous association of the white rat and the loud noise, Little Albert was classically conditioned to experience fear at the sight of the rat. Watson and his assistant found that Albert developed phobia of objects which share similar characteristics with the rat, including the family dog, a fur coat, some cotton wool, and a Father Christmas mask. This process is known as generalization. The Little Albert experiment demonstrated that classical conditioning could be used to create a phobia. A phobia is an irrational fear that is out of proportion to the danger. In this experiment, a previously unafraid baby was conditioned to become afraid of a rat. He thought that learning, experience, and environment were the most important. In his book of behaviorism, he said that, "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own specified world to bring them up in, and I will guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to be any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chef, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors." So this, a very extreme view of environment is everything. It's all about learning. It's all about experience. It's just the environment. Now, of course, if we adopt a view of this extreme, there is about to be examples that don't fit with this. That's what we are going to see next. Now, the next type of conditioning we are going to talk about is operant conditioning, also known as instrumental conditioning. This is learning the relationship between actions and rewards and punishment. It is for learning what works and what doesn't. It is learning which of your actions lead to positive results and which don't. So this is very different from classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is passive. You just sit there and you observe how stimuli interact. You respond to them, and as a result, co-occurrence of the bell and the food, you come to learn things. But instrumental conditioning or operant conditioning is based on your own actions. You act to the world, and then the way the world twists your action shapes your nature of your future actions. One of the first researchers in the area was Edward Thorndike, and later by B.F. Skinner. This theory stresses on the fact that the consequences of your actions shapes your behaviors. The theory explained that the intensity of a response is either increased or decreased as a result of punishment or reinforcement. Here is a picture of Thorndike. He worked with cats in these devices called puzzle boxes. What he did was took a hungry cat and he put him inside a puzzle box or a specially designed cage. Inside the cage, there was a lever that was connected to the door. So when the cat stepped on the lever, the front door would spring open, and there is a bowl of food just outside the cage. And as I said, the cat was hungry. And the first time Thorndike put the cat in the box, the cat would randomly step on the lever at some point. He's moving around the cage and accidentally stepped on the lever. The door springs open and he finally gets to eat the food outside the cage. Thorndike found that if he kept putting the cat in the same puzzle box, eventually the cat would learn what the lever was doing. The cat would press the lever more quickly. So Thorndike tracked the time that it took the cat to get out of the box on each trial, and he found that the cat got faster and faster. The cat essentially learned that the lever opens the door. Eventually you put the cat in the box and immediately it goes around and presses the lever so he can get out and get the food. This shows that learning has occurred. In this video here explains what Thorndike did.
But how is a new skill learned? That was a question which began to fascinate Thorndike. To answer it, he built some ingenious puzzle boxes from which cats could only escape by operating latches.
And in you go.
The cat appears to be very clever in engineering its escape, solving the problem with a deftly placed paw and a push of its nose. But Thorndike didn't believe that an animal, even a clever cat, understands the consequences of its behavior. When he placed a cat in the puzzle box for the first time, Thorndike was unable to see any evidence of flashes of insight. The successful actions appeared first by chance. He proved that the apparent cleverness arose by trial and error, and used graphs to measure the rate of learning. A well-practiced cat quickly recalls.
So the cat has learned that the lever leads to getting food. In this case, pulling lever is reinforcing gift, which is payoff that the cat wants. Thorndike summarized what was going on here as the law of effect. Based on this, Thorndike proposed the law of effect. The tendency to perform an action is increased if rewarded, and in vice versa, the tendency to perform an action is weakened if not rewarded. The law of effect is quite simple. It just says that behavior that have positive consequences are more likely to be repeated. So if stepping on the lever gets you feed when you're hungry, then you are going to be more likely to step on the lever in the future. And this makes sense, right? If you do something and something good happens as a result of that, you are more likely to do that thing in the future. Now, another researcher who expanded Thorndike's ideas and most associated with operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner. Here is a picture of Skinner. He is often regarded as a father of operant conditioning. Skinner's research on the principles of stimulus and response behavior was first performed on animals using his own invention, the operant conditioning chamber, or commonly known as Skinner box. Through these experiments, Skinner found that consequences for animals played a large role in their response behavior. For example, when a rat pulled a lever, it would receive food. Subsequently, the rat made frequent pulls on the lever. Now you might be asking yourself, how does operant conditioning differ from classical conditioning? In operant conditioning, the individual actively operates on the environment to bring about reinforcement. The response is voluntary. In classical conditioning, however, the individual is passive and the response is involuntary. There are two main components in operant conditioning. First, reinforcement, and the second is punishment. Now let's get to the categories of reinforcement. Skinner referred anything that increases a behavior as reinforcement. Reinforcements make a behavior more likely to occur again. First, we have primary reinforcers. These are consequences that satisfy a biologically built-in need. Such examples include food, shelter, and oxygen. Then we have secondary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcement refers to a situation in which a stimulus reinforces a behavior after it has been associated with a primary reinforcer. Money is an example of a secondary reinforcer. Money can be used to reinforce behaviors because it can be used to acquire primary reinforcers such as food, clothing, and shelter. Consequences such as praise, money, and feelings of success, getting good grades, are examples of secondary reinforcers. Secondary reinforcement is also known as conditioned reinforcement. Another good example of how secondary reinforcement can be used in operant conditioning is token economy. The token economy system involves rewarding people with tokens, chips, points, and stars for desired or target behaviors. These tokens can be exchanged for other items that the individual desires or wants. Parents, teachers, therapists, and many businesses frequently utilize this type of reinforcement to encourage children, clients, and customers to engage in the target behaviors. Another thing that Skinner differentiated was that reinforcement came in different types. First, we have what he called positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement involves giving you something that's good. You are adding something good is positive. If I give you an extra point when you do your homework, then that's going to increase the likelihood that you will do your homework the next day, right? If you do your homework, you get an extra point. Do that over and over, you're going to be more likely to do your homework. So the reinforcement, remember, always increases behavior. Positive reinforcement is a reinforcing consequence that increases the likelihood of the behavior. This can include praise, food, and money. Anytime you see the word reinforcement, remember we are talking about increasing a behavior. This applies even if we have what's called negative reinforcement. So we are still going to increase the behavior. But in this way, we do it by taking away something bad. Negative reinforcement is our second type that we will talk about. This is the strengthening of behavior because something negative or unpleasant is removed from the situation. Or in other words, the situation is escaped or avoided. For example, you leave the house early in order to avoid getting stuck in the traffic and being late for the class. Another example is you do your homework to prevent getting in trouble with the teacher the next day. By eliminating the undesirable outcomes of the preventative behaviors become more likely to occur again in the future. Both positive and negative reinforcement strengthen the behavior. In positive positive reinforcement, a stimulus is present, and in negative reinforcement, a stimulus is removed. This is very important concept. Skinner also investigated the role of punishment. So if a reinforcement always increases behavior, then you can say punishment always reduces behavior. So if you are reducing a behavior, then it's a punishment. Negative reinforcement is often confused with punishment, but it's not. Punishment is a consequence that decreases the frequency of the response it follows. Okay, did you catch that? Punishment decreases response. So there are two forms of punishment. You've probably already guessed there are positive punishment and negative punishment. In this case of positive punishment, we reduce the behavior by giving or adding something you don't like to decrease the behaviors. So if you play games all day and your parents yell at you and complain a lot, the yelling and the complaints are something you don't like. They are going to reduce your behavior of playing games all day. Another example is when your teacher gives you more assignments as punishment for bad behaviors. So that's an example of positive punishment. Positive punishment involves the presentation of an unpleasant stimulus or the things you don't like. Negative punishment refers to taking away something that you like. So we remove something that you want. For example, a student lost 10 points because they failed to turn in their homework on time. Negative punishment involves the removal of present stimulus or the thing that you like. However, psychologists do not suggest punishment in terms of learning unless absolutely necessary, because punishment does not promote nor teach desire or target behaviors. The schedules of reinforcement was discovered by B.F. Skinner through the observation of reward schedules with animals. It also applies to humans too. So there are 4 schedules of partial reinforcement: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval schedules. Each one has a different effect on controlling and maintaining the behaviors. If these terms of reinforcement schedules are now new to you, don't worry. I can make it simple for you. I want you to associate ratio with the number of responses. And when you see the word interval, I want you to associate the word interval with time. So ratio means the number of responses and interval means time. Fixed ratio schedules occurs when a response is reinforced only for a specific number of responses. In the classroom, an example would be a student is rewarded for every 5 books they read. The advantage in a fixed ratio schedule is that the results are high and steady productivity, or in other words, a high rate of response. In the example we just discussed, the student will continue to read books as long as the reward continued. The disadvantage is that this schedule leads to burnout and potentially lower quality work. In our example, the student may read books too quickly in order to get more rewards and not comprehend what they are actually reading. The second type of schedule we will discuss is variable ratio. This is the schedule where response is reinforced after the unpredictable number of responses. Do you know the slot machine? Gambling and lottery games are examples of a reward based on a variable ratio schedule. In the classroom, an example would be rewarding students for some homework assignments, but not all. The advantage with this type of schedule is if done in a manner that the reinforcer is not predictable. This can lead to maintenance or an increase of the pace of behavior. If the student can't determine the schedule of which the homework would be rewarded, they are going to be more likely to continue to always bring in their homework. However, the disadvantage is this type of schedule could lead to determinal behavior. In the case of gambling, the person continues to try for the reward even after losing most of all their money in hopes of winning the big one. Our next example is fixed intervals. A fixed interval is where the response is rewarded after a specified amount of time has elapsed. A real-world example of fixed interval schedule is the paycheck. Employees are reinforced weekly, monthly, depending on the pay schedule. In the classroom, this may be rewarding a student at the end of every class period or a day for good behavior. It is important for a teacher to determine the right amount of work given the reward schedule. The advantage in this case are the responses will increase gradually as the reinforcement time draws near. In our case of the student would begin to behave more towards the end of the class or the end of the day in order to ensure the reward would be provided. The disadvantage is that this type of schedule can lead to slow responding immediately after the delivery of the reinforcement. The same students having just received a reward might have poor behavior towards the beginning of the next class or the beginning of the next day, knowing that the next reward wouldn't occur for a while. Our final schedule to discuss is variable interval. A variable interval schedule is where a response is rewarded after an unpredictable amount of time has passed. Examples of this type of schedule would be a promotion or special recognition at work. If the employee knows knows there is a chance of promotion, but is unaware of the timing. This would typically elicit positive behavior, which is maintained for a long period of time. In a classroom, teachers can reward students at different times of the day for good behavior. The advantage here is this schedule is very resistant to extinction. If the student knows that if they work hard on an assignment or in class and they will eventually be rewarded, they will persist and work hard on average. However, this reinforcing schedule doesn't engage the person quickly because the reward is not imminent. Using a reinforcement of the classroom to manage behavior is successful as long as the teacher chooses appropriate reinforcement schedule. The schedule of reinforcement should be based on desired or target behavior, association with the behavior and rewards, and length of time behaviors should be maintained. Let's try a few scenarios to test your knowledge. In the following scenarios, identify which type of reinforcement schedule is being used. Scenario 1. Starbucks want to ensure a steady flow of customers. The company decides to provide a reward card to its customer. For every 5 lattes purchased, customer get 1 free. The correct response here is fixed ratio schedule. Scenario 2. A teacher gives pop-up quiz to ensure students are prepared for every class. The correct response is variable interval schedule. Scenario 3. A student receives a grade at the end of every semester, which counts toward credit for graduation. The correct response here is fixed interval. Scenario 4. A person buys lottery tickets in hope of winning millions. Correct response? Variable ratio schedule. One common type of learning involves observing and mimicking others. This social modeling is called observational learning. Observational learning has been a part of human experience for a long time, but it wasn't until somewhat recently the psychologists began to examine this phenomenon closely in an effort to understand it better. Stanford psychologist Albert Bandura conducted a social experiment that illustrated how aggressive behavior can be learned by watching violence on TV and in real life. First, a group of children watch an adult hit, kick, and sit on an inflatable boxing toy in the shape of a crowd called a bobo doll. Next, the kids were allowed to play with the toys for a short period of time, after which the toys were taken away in order to build the feeling of frustration or being angry. Then the children were allowed to play with the bobo doll. Not surprisingly, the majority of the kids imitated the adults' behavior, hitting the bobo doll, even using the toys' hammers or the guns provided. Let's watch the bobo doll experiment.
The segment you're about to see is taken from an early experiment on learning of aggressive styles of behavior through modeling. Children watched a filmed adult perform novel aggressive acts toward a inflated doll, and the physical aggression was accompanied by novel hostile remarks. We later measured how much of this modeled aggression the children had learned just by watching. Now, the measurement of learning of aggression uses simulated targets rather than live ones. For example, to test how well bombardiers have learned bombing strategies, you would use simulated targets rather than require them to bomb San Francisco or New York. The model pummeled the doll with a mallet, flung it in the air, kicked it repeatedly, threw it down, and beat it. It was once widely believed that seeing others vent aggression would drain the viewer's aggressive drive. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is hardly cathartic. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to the aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language. The room contained varied play materials.
While this experiment may seem strange and even a little cruel, there is an important lesson to be learned. We take our cues for appropriate behavior from our parents, brothers, sisters, teachers, friends, and other role models. Observation learning is a specific type of learning where observer learns the new behaviors by watching some other organism engage in a certain behavior.